Okay, welcome to tutorial video number 1, where we're going to look at making a basic design using some basic shapes, some clip art, some alignment methods, and modifications. And I already have Torchmate EDU-S opened up, so if you haven't done so, I suggest you do that to follow along. Also, make sure that if you're at this stage of working through tutorial videos, you have gone through the intro and setup video, so that your version of Torchmate is properly calibrated and is set to work for the machine that we'll be using in this course. So, step number 1, we have Torchmate opened up. We're going to create a new document by going File and then selecting New, or pushing Control and N on our keyboard. And then we're going to set up our material blank, which is defined by this darker black border around our workspace. And we're going to define that by going to the Layout menu and choosing the Material Size option. And that'll bring up our Material Size dialog window. Now, to ensure that we have matching parameters to our machine, again, the bottom left section of the origin selection map needs to be selected. And then setting your material to the size of what we're working with for this lesson is going to be a width of 12 inches and a height of 12 inches. And we'll select OK and modify our material blank to match what we're working with today. So to begin with, we're going to use a basic shape. So we'll pull up the Shapes tools. We're going to get the rectangle tool out and we're going to draw a shape. Doesn't matter right now what we draw this shape as or how big it is, because we can define the size now that we've drawn it into the workspace. So the horizontal red line is the width. We'll define that for now as 12 and hit enter. The vertical red line is defining the height, and we're also going to set that to 12 and hit enter. And we'll draw a second shape in, and this shape's width we're going to define as 11. And the height we're also going to define as 11. And again, after each time you type in the measurement, please hit the enter button on your keyboard. Now we're going to switch tools to the select tool. And what we're going to do is just zoom out by rolling our wheel of our mouse downward. And that's going to zoom out based on where my mouse was placed. So if I place my mouse over on the far right side, it zooms out onto that section of the workspace. If I want to zoom back in, I put my mouse on my pieces of material, these squares, and roll my wheel up, it zooms in on that location. So using my select tool, we're going to drag a selection box around both objects, and that is important. If I don't drag this selection box around both objects, it will not select them. So for example, if I drag this only around the smaller square, it only selects the smaller square. If I don't drag it through and around both objects, it doesn't select anything. So I'm going to select both of my objects, and I'm going to use the Layout menu. And I'm going to use this Arrange and Distribute option and go down to Align to Selected. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to center these two shapes vertically. So now they're centered in the vertical fashion. And I'll go back to that same menu. So again, Layout, Arrange and Distribute, Align to Selected, and this time I'm going to center it horizontally. And now my two squares have been centered onto each other. Now, the shapes as they stand as it is now gives me the ability to create a simple object. I cut this out of the machine, I would have two squares. What I want to do is create a frame. So I'm going to use the smaller square to cut out a space from the bigger square. And to do that, we use the weld tools. So we have the basic weld, which would join the two objects together. We have the and weld, which will keep the overlapping shapes, which means the small square would be what I have left over. And then I have the XOR weld, which is going to remove the smaller square from the bigger square. That's the overlapping area gets cut away. So that's the one I want for now. So I'm going to choose XOR weld, and it's going to cut a hole in my 12-inch square. So this is my frame. This gets me started. I'm going to move this on to the center of my material blank, and that's what these pink lines are identifying, is that I'm on the edge of my material blank, and because I have a pink line on all 4 edges, I know that I'm centered on my workspace. Now, just a note too, if I'm playing around with zooming, and let's say, for example, I get lost and I don't know where my material is, just to reset your viewing window, go to the Layout menu, go to Material Size again, and don't change any of the settings, just simply hit OK, and it recenters you back onto the material blank. So that's the first step. Now the second step we're going to do here is working with another basic shape. So we're going to get a circle. Again, we're going to draw that circle in. Doesn't matter how big, because as soon as we draw it, it asks us to define the size. Now this is asking us to define the radius, or half of the full measurement of our circle. So we're going to set this to 6 and hit enter. And that's going to create a 12-inch diameter, or 12-inch across the full measurement circle. Now, we only need half of this circle, so we're going to remove some of it. And there's two ways we can do this. Way number one is to draw a square. And we'll define the size of this square as 12 inches in width, 6 inches in height, or half of our circle. And then using our alignment tools, we're going to select both of these shapes. And we're going to align these so that they're centered horizontally and so that they're lined up on the bottom. And then I could use my weld tools again to remove the bottom half of the circle, and then simply remove or delete these little slivers on the bottom edges. And I do that just by selecting them and hitting the delete key on my keyboard. This window may come up. If you want it to no longer show up for you, just choose the do not show message anymore box and then hit yes, and it's going to delete that shape, and you won't get that message anymore when you hit the delete key. The second way to do this, I'm just going to go edit, undo, or Control Z on my keyboard just to undo this so that I get my two shapes here. Instead of having that second shape, if I take the circle and I go to my weld tools and I choose the basic weld, this now changes the state of the circle to being something I can edit. So now if I double click on my circle, again I'll get this dialog box saying that, warning, you're editing this shape. Again, just choose the don't show message again, choose yes, and it's going to bring up your editing mode. So now what I could do is select the bottom dot, hit delete, and then on my left and right dots, I check to see what my curvature is. And if I set the right-hand dot to be 0 curve, it flattens that bottom line. Now it's really important that it be the right-hand dot because the arrow that I have here is pointing, going around clockwise. If I did this to the left dot, took the curvature to 0, it flattens the line between the left dot and the top dot, which I don't want. So I'm just going to go Control Z, delete the bottom dot, select my right dot, select my curvature to be 0, hit enter, and then I'm going to hit apply. And now I have my half circle. Now we want to place this half circle into our workspace, but we want it precisely placed. So the alignment tools aren't going to work the same for us. Now if we look at the shape we have selected, it has a red line tracing around the shape, but it also has 9 little boxes. These are called nodes. And the nodes are referencing to the node selection over here on the menu at the top. And it shows me that I have the bottom center node, or nub, selected. And that allows me to position this node or nub to a specific location related to the ruler on the left and the ruler at the top. Now I have a 12-inch document, which means that the center of this would be 6 inches, and if I set the center nodes or nubs to 6 inches for X, which is the left to right, this is going to center this on my document. Now if I take the Y, and I know that I took 11 inches out of my 12-inch space, which means I have a ½ an inch to the bottom edge here, I want to go just a little bit above that. If I go 0.625, it puts my document now, or my object in my document, just above my frame. The other menu that can be controlled at the top here is the measurements of my shape. So I have my 12-inch circle by 6 inches. I can modify this further. Now, important piece of information to pay attention to is this lock icon, which deals with proportional scaling. If the lock is closed, when I change the width here from my 12 inches to being 11 inches, for example, it also scales down my height. If I unlock my proportional scaling and I take this further down to maybe 10.75 and hit enter, it keeps the height at its regular measurement that was already inputted at 5.5 inches. Okay, so I'm going to take this back to 6 inches high. I'm going to leave it at my 11 3/4 or 11.75 so that I have an equal spacing all the way around the bottom and the left and right edges of my circle. And that's going to stay right there for now. Now, this gets us into a new consideration. I'm just going to recenter. If I go to cut this in the machine as it stands right now, it's going to cut my frame and it's going to cut my half circle. But they're not going to be joined as one. And we can see that by clicking on the frame and dragging it, the half circle doesn't come with it. They're not connected. So that means that if I were to cut this in the machine, I would end up with two separate parts, which I don't want. I want one complete design. So I need to connect this half circle to this frame, but I want to leave this edge, this gap that I've created. So I'm going to go back to my shape tool. I'm going to get a rectangle, and I'm going to draw a rectangle. And I'm going to define the width as 0.125 or 0.125, which is 1/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to set my height to 1 inch. And again, I'll go back to my select tool. If I move this object now, using those nubs or nodes, if I choose the bottom left, set my Y to be 0, it's going to match this to the bottom of my workspace, the bottom of my frame. And if I set the X to match the left edge of the circle, so if I click on my circle, it tells me that the bottom node or nub is at 0.625. I can put this shape in exactly the same space. So I can go 0.625, hit enter, and it moves it to match the edge of my circle, just like that. So that gives me one placement. I'm actually going to make this a little bit shorter, just so that I can get more of the circle's curvature defined. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do the same thing on the right side. Now, instead of drawing a new shape, what I can do is select that shape, that little rectangle that I added in, and I can go to my edit menu and I can choose duplicate or Control D on my keyboard. And what that will do is make an exact copy of that object. It's basically copy paste for Torchmate. So I can move this object roughly over, but I want to get it precisely on the right edge. So I'm going to do the same process. I'm going to click on my circle. I'm going to use the right hand nub or node on my circle to get the X coordinate. And instead of having to remember that number, I can even select that number, hit Control C to copy it, go back to my other object, select the X, paste it in, and then I'll set my Y to 0, so it's right at the bottom, and it's now placed it again exactly in line with the right hand edge of my circle. It's important to note though that I've switched which node or nub I'm using to reference my measurements, so that I'm matching the right side using the right side of nodes and the left side using the left side of the nodes. Now, I've got all these objects set here. I want to get them connected together. So I can drag a selection box to select all my objects, go to my weld tools, and use the basic weld to weld these together. And now if I click on the frame and move it, the half circle as well as those two little connections that I made move along with it. So this is now one piece that would be cut out of the machine. So let's continue on here. Let's make this look a little bit more like a little design or a scene here. So first off, let's get some clip art in here. So let's bring in something that's a little more complicated than some squares and some circles. So we're going to go to the File menu. We're going to go to Import. And it's going to bring up a window for us. Now, for you, you're going to want to go to the Student Drive and then go into the Shared folder and look for the Clip Art folder. And in there will be pre-created designs for different objects. So we're going to make this a little bit of a sunset scene. So we're going to have some birds flying in the sky. So let's go here and let's get some animals. And we're going to go down and look for duck. So we're going to go down here to D. We're going to find duck. And we're going to find, I believe it's duck number 3. Yeah, so duck 3 is the file we're going to use. It's got a preview picture of 3 ducks flying together. We're going to choose Import. And your mouse cursor, you'll notice, is going to change now from being an arrow to being a square. And we're going to go up to the top left corner of our document. And we're going to click. And that's going to place our 3 ducks into our document. And now this, just like every other shape we've worked with, is something that we can move around, we can edit, manipulate it. We're going to keep it right in that very top left corner. And we're going to select that top left nub or node, and then we're going to scale this down so that it doesn't overlap this circle that we've made, or what we're going to use as the sun for our little sunset scene. So I'm going to turn the proportional scaling on, which means I'm going to make sure the lock icon is closed, and I'm going to set the height of my ducks to be 6 inches. Just make them a little bit smaller. And again, I'm going to want to connect these, because right now if I cut this out, I'd have 3 ducks cut out as one piece, and I'd have a frame with a half circle as a second piece. So I'm going to select everything, drag my selection box around, and I'm going to go to my basic weld, and I'm going to weld those ducks to my frame so that now this is part of my one-piece design. Now, to further take this along here, let's look at some modifications we can make to some shapes here. So we're going to take the rectangle tool, we're going to draw a rectangle, and let's give this rectangle some size. Let's make it 3.5 inches in width, and let's make it 1/4 of an inch, or 0.25 in height. And we'll hit enter after we enter both of those measurements. We'll get our select tool. Now, similar to what we had as an option for the circle, if we use the basic weld tool, we can now make this into a manipulative shape. But something we didn't talk about when we were looking at the circle is we can do more than just delete nodes and move things around by changing the curve. We can actually change this object into something new. So what I can do is I can double click on my line and add nodes to my design. I can even further that by moving nodes around to give this a little extra definition. And I can even move those by just moving my arrow keys on my keyboard. And further that, I can even curve the lines to give this a little bit of a smoother transition. So I'm just going to play around with these nodes and these lines a bit here, and I'm going to bring a little bit of a wave pattern into my design here. And when I'm happy with what I've created, I'm just going to hit the apply button. I'm going to play around with this a little more, get this to have a nice smooth end transition here. And you can fuss around with this as much as you want to get it perfect. What I would suggest is draw 3 of these rectangles and modify them 3 separate times. So I have one modified line or rectangle. I would draw a second one in, modify it, and then draw a third one in, modify it. So I'll draw this in again. Same size, 0.25 for my height. I'm going to go 3.5 for my width. Okay, and just to save myself some time, I'm going to hit Control D on my keyboard, make a third one. And what I would suggest is just modify the 3. And once you've got the 3 of them modified, pick which one you like best and make some duplicate copies of it so that you have that to work from. And that way you don't have to worry about making all 3 of your lines absolutely identical, because you've done one good one and then you've just copied it and placed it in the document multiple times to have. So all I'm looking for here is that I'm getting a nice rounded end here, so I can clean that up, and then I'm just looking to keep this as consistent as possible through my curve. And I think this one might be it. Oh, still a little off. I'm just going to play around a little bit more. That's pretty good. So I'm going to delete that first one that I did, and I'm not even going to bother with my third one. I've got a really nice wave here. I'm going to place this one up in the top here. I'm making sure that it's overlapping my frame a little bit so that I can weld it to that frame later. I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to place a second one in here. And what I'm going to actually even do is I'm going to make this one be a little bit bigger. And what's important is that because I'm dragging it from the corner, it automatically proportionally scales it. It's making the width and the height change. Whereas if I chose the center node or nub here, it's only going to stretch the length, which means that the height stays consistent all the way. And I'm going to actually skew my object. which if that's what you're looking for, you can absolutely go ahead and do that. I want to keep this proportionate, so I'm going to add a third one here now. I'm going to make that one even longer than the last one, and I'm just going to fine tune this a bit here, moving around my little waves. And now I'm going to connect my waves to my frame. So just like before, I'm going to select everything. I'm going to go basic weld and join that in. And I'm just going to recenter this by going to my material size. So I've got pretty little nifty design going here, just using some basic shapes and some clip art. But just to further hit home that this is a horizon and a sun sort of scene with some birds floating in the sky and some wind blowing at them, I'm going to use the clip art again. I'm going to go out of the animals folder though this time, and I'm going to go down to transportation, and I'm going to look for a boat. And there's a few different boat designs. So you got your old school sailing boat here. I actually really like this cruise ship, so I'm going to go with that. I'm going to place this just over top of my circle, and I'm just going to place it so that it's right at the bottom of my document. So again, I'm using my nodes or my nubs, and I'm going to set the Y to be 0, so it's right at the bottom. And I'm just going to honestly use my arrow keys to push this over to the left a little bit, and I'm going to shrink it down a little bit just so that it fits inside of my sun, and I'm going to keep it kind of there off to the right, but I think I'm going to lift it up so it's like the bottom of the frame is the crest of the water, because you can see it's got the water coming out here. So I'm just going to shift that up. And then the last piece here that I'm going to work on with this design is I'm going to take all of my objects, my frame, my sun or my half circle, my wind waves, and my ducks. I'm going to cut the ship out. So I'm going to use that XOR weld again. That's going to remove that from my document. Now it's created a little bit of an overlap here, so I have a little shape that I'm going to delete, and a little shape that I'm going to delete. And then I want to clean up this bottom edge, so I'm just going to double click and delete these nodes at the very bottom here, so I get my straight clean edge of my frame back in here. And I'm also going to, if you look, this shape right here actually isn't connected to anything. So I'm just going to double click on it, and I'm going to select these nodes or nubs and just push the up arrow key so that it overlaps. Do the same thing with these bottom ones so it overlaps. And I'll come down here. This is a part of the same shape design. Lift those dots up. I'm going to lift these ones down. And I think this shape here, I'm actually going to delete it. So I'm just going to hit Control, select one node so that they all get selected, hit Delete, and that shape's just going to get deleted. And I'm going to select everything again, go back to my basic weld, join those shapes in now so that they're a part of the design. And if I wanted to, I could further clean this up. These lines here are pretty thin. I could look at removing them. But I think for what I'm going to do here today, this is pretty good. The only thing I might look at doing would be removing some of this stuff. So I'm just going to delete some of these nodes here. And again, you can get really lost in the design of this if you wanted to. That gives me a nice crisp, clean bottom edge again. And if I wanted to, I could delete some of these nodes here as well. These are the bottoms of those thin lines, just to get these a little bit more crisp and clean, and make this something that really can stand out. And again, with the lines in the edit mode here, you can get lost as to what is going to be a shape and what isn't. So I'd really recommend toggling between having it as a solid and having it as a missing fill design. So I'm just going to leave it like that. So I'm going to recenter this so I can see my design. So there is my cruise ship sailing over the horizon, just breaking the crest of the water. Sun setting or rising, depending how you want to look at it in the background. Some wind blowing across the ocean, and we've got some ducks flying overhead. And again, this is all connected together, so if I did take this to go cut in the machine, it comes away as one design. Okay, so that is using some basic shapes, some clip art, some modifications, and some alignment tools to create a scene or a design. What I'm looking for you to do is to complete this design and submit it, but also create your own version of this. It doesn't have to be a cruise ship sailing in the ocean. It could be a plane flying in the sky. The wind lines could become clouds. You could switch out the ducks for being other birds or something else flying around with that plane. It could be a beach with the water and some birds flying overhead, and again change it to clouds, or have the sun up in the sky instead of just above the horizon. Whatever you want. So I'm looking for two designs. One where you follow along with what I just did here to the best of your ability and submit that, and one where you recreate this scene to make it your own. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, pitter patter.